Hello, I have done classical conditioning in this video. So let's talk about the person who discovered classical conditioning first. He was Ivan Pavlov. He was born on 26 September 1849 and died on 27 February 1936. He was a Russian physiologist known primarily for his work in classical conditioning. He is a Nobel Prize winner too. He won a Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1904. So, how did he make his new discovery about classical conditioning, or how did he come across classical conditioning? He had been studying the secretion of stomach acids and salivation in dogs in response to the ingestion of varying amounts and kinds of food. While doing this, he observed a curious phenomenon. Sometimes, stomach secretion and salivation would begin when no food had actually been eaten by his dog. The mere sight of the food bowl, the individual who normally bought the food, or even the sound of that individual's footsteps was enough to produce physiological response in the dog. He then discovered that the dog was responding not only on the basis of biological need, that is hunger, but also as a result of learning called classical conditioning. He conducted series of experiments to demonstrate and analyze this. In one, he attached a tube to the salivary gland of a dog, which allowed him to measure the amount of salivation that occurred. He then sounded tuning fork, and just a few seconds later, he presented the dog with meat powder. This pairing was carefully planned so that the same period of time elapsed between the presentation of sound and meat powder and occurred repeatedly. At first, the dog would salivate only when the meat powder was presented, but soon the dog began to salivate at the sound of tuning fork. In fact, even when Pavlov stopped presenting meat powder, the dog would still salivate at the sound of tuning fork. It now has been classically conditioned to salivate to the tone. So, before conditioning, there are two unrelated stimuli. Number one, the sound of tuning fork. Number two, the meat powder. The sound of tuning fork, which is a neutral stimulus, does not lead to salivation, but to some irrelevant response such as pricking of ears or perhaps a stratal reaction and no salivation. Meat powder is considered as unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that brings about a response without having been learned. It automatically causes salivation to occur. The response, salivation, that the meat powder produced is called unconditioned response, a response that is natural and needs no learning. During conditioning, the tuning fork is repeatedly sounded just before presenting meat powder. The main goal of conditioning is to associate the sound of tuning fork with meat powder, and therefore to bring about the same sort of response during this period. Salivation gradually increases every time the tuning fork is sounded until the tuning fork alone causes the dog to salivate. And when finally the conditioning is complete, the tuning fork has evolved from neutral stimulus. The tuning fork has evolved from neutral stimulus to what is now called the conditioned stimulus. At this time, salivation that occurs as a response to the tuning fork is considered as the conditioned response. After conditioning, conditioned stimulus produced conditioned response. With classical conditioning, the definition is: classical conditioning is a kind of conditioning in which a previously neutral stimulus comes to elicit a response through its pairing or association with the unconditioned stimulus that naturally brings about the response. That's it for today. Thank you.